Welcome to our lecture series on fundamentals of game design and gameplay. We are discussing on how to incorporate stories and narratives into games. We are discussing key concepts of incorporating stories, and we are also talking about interactive stories, and we found that narratives are an important part of interactive stories. We were discussing about roles of narrative, what narratives, what kind of purpose narratives serve in uh, games. So there are some reasons here and some here. So the narrative, they can show the prologue to the game or to the current level. They can introduce the player to the situation in the game and create a background for the game. Players who don't like stories in game, they can just ignore the story, but many players will enjoy them. Now little bit of advertising. justetchhosting.com, our hosting service, university.justetch.org, offline and online training, computer.justetch.net, short notes and training videos, mall.justetch.org, our shopping mall, jobs.justetch.net, recruiting service, software development and corresponding consulting service. Now watch our previous videos as well. Now what are the different forms, or what are the commonly used narrative blocks in stories? In stories, not in games. In games, how narratives are introduced or incorporated. Sometimes they can be incorporated as an opening sequence to introduce the story at the beginning, just like in Half-Life. As an ending sequence at the end of the gameplay, you can summarize the story or tell something future about the story to give some emotional meaning to the player. To wrap up the story when the player completes the game. It can be also as part of the ending sequence as an interlevel sequence. When player move on one level to another, maybe you can give some introduction to the next level using some sort of narrative block, or maybe wrapping up current level and telling the player about his success or what he has earned or what he has lost, and maybe along with the future level information, and in the form of cutscenes in between gameplay, in between games. And this will be short, non-interactive cutscene sequence, and it is presented during the gameplay or gameplaying, and it will interrupt the game momentarily, and it will be some sort of a story will be presented to the player. For example, in Half-Life, it just includes some sort of narrative in the beginning of the game. The player's avatar takes a tram ride through the research complex. A voice explains why he is there. This opening sequence introduces the game world, sets the stage for the experience to follow. The player has to know this story and to act based on this story. Actually, the player is told that some aliens has attacked the research lab or something like that. You can watch this YouTube video on Half-Life and you will know the story. Now, when you include narrative blocks presented between levels, I think the narrative block, they can be 30 seconds to 4 or 5 minutes long. Usually the beginning sequence and ending sequence, those are longer than the cutscenes used in between. And beginning and ending blocks, they usually provide important narrative bookends to the entire experience of the game. Halo 2, for the game Halo 2, the introductory scene is more than 5 minutes. You can take a look at the game at this place. Now, the narrative blocks, the cutscenes that we use during the play, that you will use during the play, it should usually be shorter, as they will interrupt the flow of the game and rhythm of the player's actions. So in fast moving game, usually the real-time strategy games and action adventure games, the player wants to act, they don't want to watch your cutscenes, so they may get annoyed. So don't include cutscenes, or if you still do, if you feel the need that you need to narrate some story, but keep it short. In slower moving games such as adventure games and role-playing games, you may include cutscenes to introduce the story the players may like, because they are slow-moving game players, and the type of games they also require some sort of story to proceed through the game plots. What are the different forms of narratives that games use? I think by this time we know from our previous discussion, a pre-rendered movie, it can be used at the beginning, at the end, or as a cutscene. A cutscene displayed by the graphic engine. It's not a pre-rendered movie, but the graphics engine will create those sequence of events and those scenes, maybe cutting some stuff from the using the characters from the game itself. You can use scrolling text for the as a narratives and introduce some story or some mission to the player. A voice can explain the backstory of the game, what the player has to do in the future, or the game plot, situation of the game. And a player, by using some monologue dialogues, he can also state the game story or current status of the game, current situation of the game, or the current situation of the gameplay. Yeah, individual lines of dialogue that a character is telling is not narrative, is not part of the narrative. But if there are some interactive dialogues between the player and the non-player character, by this interaction the story will be revealed, the story will be told to the player, so it also forms narratives. And we always have to balance between narrative and gameplay. The games are about gameplay, the interactions with the game world. Players come to enjoy the game and interact with the game. They don't want to. The primary purpose is gameplay, but the narrative, if that adds value to the entertainment, you are including narrative. So you should keep balance. Why? Because the more narrative you include, the more the player has to sit down and watch it and do nothing. So games must find appropriate balance between designers need to narrate the story to the player and the players need to act. Too much narrative, it's bad value for the players' money, because players pay to act in a fantasy. Computer game is about interactivity, so you should provide sufficient narrative to enrich the game world, but should not interfere with the player's intention to act and to enjoy the gameplay. Now, some concepts between dramatic tension and gameplay tension. I think in games we have the gameplay tension. You should keep it as part of the gameplay. That's how the game becomes enjoying. So it is the player's desire to overcome a challenge. But what is dramatic tension? In movies or in books, stories, novels, the reader or watcher tries to find what will happen next. It's just the dramatic tension in those things, but in games it is player's desire to overcome the challenge. These two things are not the similar. Many times people try to show that they are the same, but they are not the same. That is a false analogy. Anyway, so in game design we have to focus to give gameplay events or gameplay challenges to the player that the player has to overcome. Okay, tune to our next video that will talk about storytelling and how you incorporate stories, or how this storytelling engine and the background core mechanics will interact to facilitate storytelling. Okay, thanks, have a good day, bye.